From something we haven't seen.
Okay.
The person showed up in a show we have seen.
You ready?
Yeah.
All right. All right, everybody. Is this on?
It's on?
Yeah, it's on. Okay, cool. Hey, everybody, thank you so much for being here. If there's more food, I think just feel free to keep getting it as we're talking. But we're going to get the formal portion of this party started. And for those of you who don't know me, my name is Leah Jolly. I work here in the communications department. I'm a student in the MDiv and THM programs, but that's not why we're here. We're here for Dr. Danny Daley. And he is the assistant professor of New Testament here, came on faculty in 2023. He was raised in California, pastored a church in Nevada, and then he's lived in Scotland, Ireland, and Belgium with his wife Brennan and their 3 kids. So West Coast, Europe, everywhere in between, he's been there. And he teaches New Testament here. See, if you've probably had him for interpreting the New Testament, Mission of God. I have him for the Gospel of Matthew right now. He's teaching a class on my favorite book of the Bible, Hebrews, next semester. Thank you. And we're here to talk about his brand new book, Ideal Disciples. Came out this year with Baylor Press in May, but we're now just getting around to formally debuting it to you guys. For those of you who are here for Hybrid Week, you can get this at Baker Bookhouse, and I'm pretty sure they have a student discount. All right, thank you, Brennan. 25% off. You can get this at Baker Bookhouse just down the road, or get it on Amazon, but this is why we're here. So would you please join me in welcoming Dr. Danny Daley?
That was both mics?
Yep.
Thank you all. It's good to be here with you.
All right, so first questions first. And you guys will have a chance to ask questions as well. So if something comes up, write it down. We're going to take audience Q&A later. Dr. Daley, let's start at the kind of top. How did you discover your vocation as a professor and a scholar? And how would you describe the task of a New Testament scholar?
Good questions. So how I discovered it, well, other people discovered it, I think, and then told me that this is what I should probably do. So when I was doing pastoral ministry in Nevada, I was a pastor for 8 years. And I did a lot of preaching, but my main role, it was kind of a large church, so there were lots of pastors, and everybody kind of had specializations, right? Things that you really spent most of your time on. And for me, when I wasn't preaching, it was all discipleship. I was spending time with people on an individual basis. I was discipling people and discipling them to disciple others, and I was raising up leaders and small group leaders and writing curriculums and those sorts of things. So my face was in the text all the time. And so between having a passion for helping other people to understand the text better and to teach the text, then I just consistently had mentors around me speaking into me this idea that I should go and continue my education and maybe become a scholar and a professor and train pastors as opposed to being one. Not that you ever really stop being one, right? If you're doing it well, I think that I believe very much in the scholar-pastor, pastor-scholar thing, that every pastor should be scholarly and every scholar should be very pastoral. But anyway, there is obviously a difference in vocation. So after 8 years in ministry, there's a long story I won't get into as to exactly what it is God used to just sort of kick us into following that path that people had been speaking into me. But after about 8 years of ministry and having people consistently affirm that, my wife and I finally just made the decision that we needed to do it. I'd already had a bachelor's in Bible and theology from Multnomah University up in Portland, Oregon. And so after talking about it with my wife, we made the decision to apply to master's degree programs. It was one of those things where I applied to a few different ones, assuming I might just hopefully get into one, right? But in case there were more than one opportunity, then my wife and I were kind of praying together, but also independently of one another, and not really sharing a whole lot about what the Spirit was saying to us. But we were both sort of independently hearing from the Spirit that we should move to Europe and actually do my master's work over there. And so when I got into a program at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland, I said, hey, what do you think about this one? And she's like, that's the one the Spirit's telling me we should do. And I said, well, that's exactly what he's been telling me, so I guess that's... So really it was kind of the combination of those two things. Other mentors speaking into me that I should do it, and then the movement of the Spirit confirming to the two of us independently of one another in some sense that we were supposed to do it and where we were supposed to do it, and it just sort of came together after that. The second question that you have is a very good one, the task of a New Testament scholar. I think that that's different for different scholars. I think there are many ways to do New Testament scholarship. I think it depends on the individual and depends maybe on the institution, right? How we do something like this here at Calvin will probably look different than maybe the way New Testament scholars did it in Europe, where I did a lot of my education. But I think for me, one of the things that's important is a lot of New Testament scholars, their main task, their main role is to try to provide ancient answers to ancient questions that derive from reading ancient texts, right? That's like the base level of what it is a New Testament scholar, I think, should do. So you're taking the original languages and historical questions and old sociological questions and all of that. But I think for a place like Calvin, we have this benefit of being able to not stop there, right? So my job is to really find these ancient answers to these ancient questions found in these ancient texts, and then also figure out how to then meet with a group of students who really believe that these things are God speaking to us, and to figure out what it is he's trying to say to us and how then to apply that to the way that we minister to other people and live our lives in the modern world. So I think it's kind of the two-pronged, right? It's doing that ancient historical and critical, text critical work, but then applying it to our modern, the way we live life every day. So.
Yeah. So you mentioned, you're finding, ancient texts, ancient scriptures. You wrote a whole commentary on one of those called Matthew's Beatitudes. On Matthew's Beatitudes, but we're called Ideal Disciples. Can you tell us a little bit about how this book came to be? Because it's a fascinating story and I love to hear it. And give us a little summary about what are you seeking to accomplish in a commentary on the Beatitudes?
Yeah, so how it came to be, it's really it derives from the book that I published right before it. So it's a kind of a loose sequel. The last one, I talked a lot about inheritance language in all sorts of Jewish and Christian texts. So I look at things all the way back. I start in Genesis and just move forward on how does inheritance function in the Pentateuch and in the prophets and those kinds of places. I even look at non-biblical texts, Dead Sea Scrolls, how does inheritance function there? This idea that the world thinks of inheritance as just your parents pass away and they give you stuff. Which is great if we have that blessing. But in the Bible, not only is that the context of inheritance, but we have God as our great parent, like the Heavenly Father, like the parent of all parents, right? The Israelites, I'm convinced, thought of him as like the chief ancestor over all the tribes of Israel. And he gives us an inheritance, which is this eternal, everlasting inheritance. So I wanted to unpack sort of how the language of that worked. And all of that culminated in Matthew's Gospel, and one of the most important places inheritance is described, I think, is in the Beatitudes, where it says, blessed or flourishing, how I translate it. Flourishing are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. And so it really started there with just looking at that one individual verse, and in my first book, I unpacked that one verse for something 30 or 40 pages, I think. And then, so there was sort of two results from that. The first is that as friends and family members bought that book and started to read it, I kept consistently hearing from them that they were all confused because I wrote it. It's a very technical project, right? It's written for a very academic audience. But then, insofar as they could navigate it, they thought, one, I would like this in simpler language, and then two, I'd like you to be able to do what you're doing for that beatitude and unpack it for the rest. So a lot of it, this is just born out of that request that I got from people like my grandfather, who I love. He called me and he said, I'd like to know what you think about the rest of these now. Which is, I dedicated the book to my grandparents. And so, yeah, it was kind of like, that was the task. Okay, well, I'm going to do that now. I'm going to try to explain the Beatitudes in a bit simpler language. It's still, I think, written for an academic audience, maybe like a seminary audience, as opposed to just scholars. But I wanted to really tease out what I thought about Beatitudes in sort of the rest of the text and explicate that a bit more fully. So that was the impetus for it ultimately, was that.
So before you get into the actual Beatitudes, and we'll talk about the translation of flourishing versus blessed, but you in the introduction, you talk about how the Pharisees and the religious leaders of Jesus' day are often very negatively portrayed. And can you walk us through kind of why this negative portrayal is so prevalent, but then how we could kind of reframe our perspective on the Pharisees, on the religious leaders, as we see them presented in Matthew and other parts of the New Testament?
Yeah, it's interesting that that's one of the questions you ask, because I only talk about that problem for about 6 or 7 pages in the introduction and don't spend a lot of time on it. But it is important because in Matthew's gospel in particular, there is this just piercingly negative portrayal of a lot of the Jewish leaders, and the Pharisees get the brunt of that. They're not the only ones. The chief priest describes the Pharisees. They're all targets, both for Jesus and for Matthew's writer at various points. But there are places like in Matthew's woes in Matthew 23, which is only found in Matthew. You don't find those woes, those particular woes anyway, in any of the other Gospels, where Jesus pronounces these woes against the Pharisees for the ways in which they're leading the Israelites poorly. And through the whole Gospel, Jesus is constantly going back and forth with the Pharisees, and they're constantly antagonizing him and his disciples. And it has, in history, then created this perception of the Pharisees historically that they are the bad guys, right? And usually when you meet people that are legalistic in some sense, we might even refer to them as Pharisaic, like, oh, that's he or she, they're Pharisaical, right? Usually we mean legalistic when we say that. But there has been a bit of a reclamation project among a lot of scholars in the last 10 or 15 years to actually, to some degree, try to rescue the reputation of the historical Pharisees. Because although it's clear that Jesus definitely had an antagonistic relationship, at least with some of the Pharisees that he engaged with on a regular basis, there were something like 8,000 of them throughout Judea at the time, and he certainly didn't interact with all of them. And we know from history, actually, a little bit after the time of Jesus, when Rome and Israel had the Jewish War, 66 to 70 AD, and when Rome came in and sacked the city and destroyed the temple, it was actually the Pharisees, in the aftermath of all that, that kind of kept Judaism afloat for the next several decades. Like Jewish people today look back at the Pharisees of that time as the good guys for essentially saving their culture and rescuing the sort of the historical trajectory of Judaism for the next several decades. And so there is this reclamation project and a bit of a reckoning with how we perceive of these things. And all of this became, I think, even more important in the aftermath of World War II, because negative depictions of the Pharisees in the New Testament were then projected on Jewish people as a whole, which created a whole lot of anti-Semitism. It was used as an excuse for a lot of anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism rhetoric during World War II. And lots of anti-Semitism even long before that, right? And so really what I try to do in the 6 or 7 pages that I treat it, because obviously the Beatitude, my take in the book is that the Beatitudes contrast with the woes in Matthew 23. That when Jesus pronounces the woes in Matthew 23, he's talking about the way that the Pharisees have failed in their task of shepherding Israel. You know, Jesus in Matthew 10 calls them the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Well, the reason they're lost sheep is because their leaders have failed. And I think that in the Beatitudes, Jesus is proclaiming the kind of disciple that he expects us to be, and he contrasts that with the Pharisees in a lot of ways. In other words, you have a decision to make. You're either going to follow the leadership of the Pharisees, which has failed, which has not been merciful, or you're going to do it the way I'm telling you to do it, and that the Beatitudes are maybe the first place of many places in Matthew where he starts to lay out his paradigm, his project for what he wants a disciple to be like, to live like, the way he wants us to carry ourselves. And there is this contrast in the text that I think is quite clear. And Jesus is not the only one to have confrontations with them. Josephus talks about the Pharisees, and he didn't care for them very much. They're probably depicted in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the Qumran community that wrote those scrolls didn't really seem to care for the Pharisees very much either. So it's not like Jesus is alone in having these conflicts. Lots of people had conflicts with them. But it's also the case in a nuanced portrait that the way we've received the Pharisees and thought about them throughout history has been used to justify a lot of anti-Semitism. So I try in the beginning of the book, that's one of the things I try to unpack, because the rest of the book I'm going to point out several times. Here's another place where Jesus has another conflict with these Pharisees, and eventually that really starts to get overwhelming, and I wanted to sort of start that conversation by at least interjecting some nuance into it to say, hey, wait a minute, let's think more clearly about the history of this before we demonize the whole group.
So if you haven't read the book yet, introduction's already going to be so fun. At least I was like, oh, you said what about them? So where's my Greek fans, Greek scholars in the room? Yeah? I'm seeing like no hands here. All right. Regardless of whether or not you know Greek well, and I'm admitting I do not know Greek as well as I'd like to, at the beginning of every chapter on each Beatitude, Dr. Daley takes the original Greek and translates it. So you're going to see his voice come through on that. But you have one particular word translation decision in each one, where in our Bibles we might see the word blessed start each Beatitude, and you translate it as flourishing. What is your reason for this translation? And then what difference does this change in wording make, and how you understand and interpret the Beatitudes.
Yeah, it makes all the difference. I will say the word choice that I came up with, flourishing, isn't mine. I do get that from another scholar. But the need to come up with a different word is something that lots of Matthean scholars have been dealing with. And so I just looked at lots of the different proposals that have been out there over the last 15 or 20 years and chose the one that I think that fits the best. But really, here's the issue, right? So the word that, again, in English, and this, it creates a controversy because the Beatitudes are one of the most beloved passages in the Bible, right? And how many of us have heard sermons on or even recited the Beatitudes? Blessed are, right? Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. And it's a beloved text with a very cemented translation. So trying to shift the ground on that a little bit can get quite controversial for the obvious reasons, especially in churches. If you were to just get up and read that differently, people would probably be quite shocked. But there really are good reasons to rethink it. So the word there, makarios, introduces Beatitudes as a type of literature. It's not really a genre so much as a mode of expression. A Beatitude is a mode of discourse, a way of saying a certain kind of thing. So really, scholars have had to ask the questions about what that word is trying to really introduce. And is it introducing something like blessedness? And in particular, the word blessed sounds quite passive. Blessed are, meaning those of you who are these things, you will be blessed. It sounds quite passive, like you're waiting then on God. You assume, right, that it's maybe a divine passive, that you're waiting on God to do the blessing. So, hey, blessed are you that are poor in spirit. And then it tempts you to translate poor in spirit as a negative thing, potentially. The poor in spirit, you don't want to be poor in spirit, but if you are, don't worry. You'll be blessed by God because yours will be the kingdom of heaven. So then it turns into this sort of a merely eschatological expectation. It's some future blessing that's going to come down the road, and it's okay if I get through for now. Things might get tough. God's got my back. I just have to wait. And a lot of people have translated the Beatitudes or interpreted them that way, and the word choice there might be part of the reason why that happens. The problem is that a lot of scholars have realized that there is a very particularly ethical connotation to a lot of Beatitudes, and in particular Matthew's are probably more ethical than even most Beatitudes. So there is this very specific ethical thing going on. So there's other Beatitudes like blessed are the peacemakers. Well, that's something you should want to go do. That's not an unfortunate circumstance that you want to be freed from or rescued from. That's something you should go out and pursue. What do I have to do to cultivate that? How do I become a peacemaker? So maybe I could still say that if I'm a peacemaker, I will be blessed by God. But the ethical dimensions of it did cause scholars for a long time to go back and revisit this whole thing. And actually quite a few scholars now have come to the conclusion that blessed is just really not the right word because it removes a bit of that ethical ramifications from the text. So R.T. France, in his famous commentary, he went with happy, which was maybe a little bit better, but still a lot of people think not quite right. And then Casey Hansen, he went with honorable. Honorable are those who do these things, which is probably a little bit closer. And then Jonathan Pennington, New Testament scholar who's written a bunch on Matthew, he came up with flourishing because he realized that the Beatitudes were quite similar to a lot of old Greek and Roman virtue ethics descriptions of what it means to flourish in life. And his argument is that that's what Jesus was doing, is he was describing flourishing, actually. He was describing something you should go out and want to cultivate in all of those Beatitudes, something that you should want to go and become, that Jesus wants us to go and become. And so that motivated his change to flourishing, and I read all the arguments carefully and agreed with that one more than the others, and so that's the one that I also elected to go with. Rather than continue to reinvent the wheel by offering just one more possibility, I thought it was best to just see the ones that have been offered over the last 15 years and finally just pick one and argue in favor of that. So that's the one I went with.
So throughout the book, you focus on how each beatitude speaks to character traits that make an ideal disciple of Jesus Christ. Mm-hmm. Hence where you got the title of the book. Mm-hmm. How do the Beatitudes accomplish this?
Yeah, I think there's two ways. I kind of alluded to the first part of this earlier, where I think there are character groups in Matthew's gospel. So you have the disciples as a character group, you have the Jewish leaders as a character group, and Matthew does tip his hand that he's aware of the fact that the Jewish leadership groups are different. The Pharisees aren't the Sadducees, who aren't the chief priests, who aren't the scribes. There are differences, but Matthew does kind of minimize the differences between them, and he just lumps them all together as these failed shepherds. And then you have the crowds, which really serve as almost like a neutral group in between those two. So Jesus says, here's what an ideal disciple is. This is what that looks like. Here's the scribes and Pharisees as failed shepherds. Here's what that looks like. And you crowds, you have a decision now that you have to make. Which of those two do you want to be? Do you want to follow the way God is calling you to live, which is the discipleship model that I'm presenting to you, or do you want to follow the failed leaders? And I think that what is going on in the Beatitudes is that Jesus, if you think about it, it's the very first thing that he teaches. And even though I'm convinced Mark was probably the first gospel written, Matthew canonically is the first one we come to. So when you open your New Testament and you start to read, the very first thing you see Jesus say is, repent for the kingdom of heaven is at hand, and then he jumps right into the Beatitudes immediately. That's the first impression that he's giving you, is these instructions, these modes of being, right? So I think he's offering this up in order to say, this is what I expect a disciple to be like, to look like. These are the virtues I hope that you would develop and cultivate. And so then that leads to the second point about this, is that I really believe that if you think about ethics, and we have an ethicist right here, so maybe he'll correct me later, but if you think about ethics, I think about ethics in this way, that first you have ethical decisions, active decisions you have to make, and we make them every day. Like you're confronted with having to do a certain thing in a certain moment. But I think there's a secondary category that precedes that, which you can call ethical dispositions, which are the kinds of character traits you develop that will then predict which kinds of decisions you will make, and actually even maybe allow you to make the right choice because you've developed the dispositions that will lead to those choices. So an example I use in the book is a drinking glass. If you think about a drinking glass, one of its dispositions is that it's fragile. Every time I say the word fragile, I think about fragile. Anybody get the reference? Movie Christmas Story, the leg lamp, fragile. Glasses are fragile, they're fragile, right? So a drinking glass is fragile. But if a glass breaks, it's not because it was fragile, because we actually expect the glass to do the opposite. Think about that. It's a fragile item, but if you pour hot liquid into it, you expect it to hold, not to shatter and spill hot liquid all over you. If a glass breaks, it's because I enacted some kind of force upon it. I dropped it on the ground, or I smashed it with a hammer. So the glass didn't break because it's fragile. It broke because I hit it with a hammer. But its fragility predicted it would break if I did that, right? So I think that the Beatitudes function the same way. That Jesus is essentially setting these things out to say, you're going to come up against persecution, which, by the way, is how he ends the Beatitudes, right? The last one is all about persecution. You're going to face persecution. Life will be hard. Things are going to be difficult. You're going to have to make important decisions as you follow me, Jesus. I'm not Jesus, but speaking as him. And ultimately, if you're going to follow God, you're going to have to make very important decisions. So as you come up against persecution, as somebody tries to drop that hammer on you, rather than being fragile, these Beatitudes will actually help to strengthen you so that you have the dispositions that will help you to make the right ethical choices as you move along. So things like poor in spirit, I argue, is something like reliance upon God and a knowledge that you need him, right? And if you think about, things like peacemaking, that's an obvious one, right? That you have to go out and actively make peace. And so I think that that's how the Beatitudes are functioning, and that's how I argue. And I also think that they sort of function within the context of Matthew, that the rest of the text then even spells out if you read carefully. Like Jesus mentions the Beatitudes, and then in other places throughout the whole text, he'll say things that kind of refer back to them and helps to explicate the meaning of them and to explain them further. So I really think he's doing it to develop the dispositions of the disciples that will then make the right kinds of choices as we move along and follow him well. One more quick thing I'll say about that is that the Beatitudes say things like thirst for righteousness, right? And at one point Jesus says, your righteousness must exceed that of the scribes and Pharisees. Because we're very Pauline a lot of the time, we think of righteousness only as sort of something that is given to us as a gift by God. It's Jesus' righteousness. And while that is true in many contexts, I think Matthew is actually using the word righteousness to describe behavior, because he says that about Joseph before he even gets to the Beatitudes. He says of Joseph that because Joseph was going to show mercy to Mary and divorce her quietly rather than expose her publicly for getting pregnant outside of the context of marriage, because he was going to treat her mercifully, he was therefore righteous. It actually calls him righteous, uses the same terminology. And Jesus then calls out the Pharisees for that exact thing, a lack of mercy on several occasions, right? He says things like, go and learn what this means. He quotes Hosea, go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. So that's why another reason why I think behavior is in view here, because he's trying to get disciples to understand what it means to live merciful, loving, peacemaking lives towards the people around us.
I love that. And if this isn't already convincing you to read the book, we're going to give you one more. So you have a whole room of students here. Well, students, faculty, but a lot of these folks are training to become pastors or teachers. What advice do you have for them as they preach or teach the Beatitudes in their contexts?
Yeah, it's funny because I've actually thought about that quite a few times. I've heard, and I want to say this as charitably as I possibly can, as a person who spent 8 years as a pastor, the last thing I want to do is be hypercritical towards pastors who are doing their best. But I've probably heard the Beatitudes preached less ideally than I would have liked, more than almost any other passage. Did I say that charitably enough, hopefully? And here's what I would really recommend people do. Even if you disagree with my conclusions, that's fine. But I think if you're going to preach the Beatitudes, there's two things. The first is to put a lot of thought into what a beatitude is. Like, how does a beatitude function? And there are a few different ways beatitudes can function in different contexts, so there's not just one, you can't just come up with one paradigm, one idea, and say all beatitudes work this way. Because in the same way that a word can have several meanings depending on a context, a beatitude can function in different ways depending on a context. But there's also a limit to how many different things a beatitude can do. So the first thing is to figure out, what does a beatitude do? How does it function as a piece of communication? And then the second part of that would be to say, how do I preach these Beatitudes in a way where it demonstrates a unity between them? So in other words, look at Matthew's Beatitudes. How do these Beatitudes function as a unit? And then make sure you're preaching them consistently all the way through as a single unit of communication, rather than thinking them as a bunch of disconnected, abstract, individual verses that have no relationship to one another. Because a lot of the time what happens is that people will preach a beatitude and they'll preach one, and then the next week they'll preach the next one, but you can't really actually see how there's a flow and a rhythm to all the beatitudes as a unit, because they're sort of disembodied from one another. And I don't think that that's what Matthew's doing at all, or Jesus in Matthew. I think Jesus has an intentionality for a flow, to a unity behind what he's trying to describe there by using them all. The last thing I would say is this. What I also see with the Beatitudes a lot is that people will look at a word in the Beatitudes and then they'll apply it so generally that it could mean almost anything that they associate. So, peacemaker, what does that mean? They just think about any and all possible contexts where peacemaking is necessary and then say, that's what Jesus meant. But in reality, that's probably not the case. And I argue in the book that that's definitely not the case, that in the Gospel of Matthew itself, what Jesus means by those Beatitudes is explained within the text. So that if you read the whole of the Gospel of Matthew as a narrative and apply sort of a narrative reading of the text, that you'll figure out then through the rest of the study what Jesus means by each of those. So peacemaking can mean lots of things as a Christian, I would say, but Jesus' meaning in that verse doesn't mean any and all forms of peacemaking, I think. I think it means specific things he's alluding to in Matthew. So I would say just be careful to the context as you preach it.
I'm sensing another book on the horizon just with this answer alone. I want to turn it to you all for your questions for Dr. Daley. Have about 15 minutes, I would say. So what questions do you guys have?
The ethicist, right in.
So I just wonder if you could say more about if the Beatitudes are implied requiring virtues. In what sense is blessed are you when they persecute you a virtue that it's calling for? Doesn't that seem to be more like proclaiming good news for somebody who's just in a victimization state that they wouldn't want to be in?
Yeah. No,
Would you mind repeating his question?
Yeah, it's a great
too,
question. So his
for
question is,
listeners?
if the Beatitudes in Matthew are describing virtuous dispositions rather than just negative circumstances that we have to make our way through, then what do we do with at the end when he does say, blessed or flourishing? How do you flourish if you're being persecuted? And so a big part of the argument that I make there, though, is that it's about applying the rest of the Beatitudes to that situation, which does then become a virtuous approach to the way that you handle the persecution. And so my argument there with the it is the toughest one to argue. And in fact, ethicists who write on the Beatitudes, almost always in every one of their books, you get to the last one and they say, this is the hardest one to apply an ethical reading to. And I would agree with that. I think that's true. But really then it becomes about understanding that maybe the reason why Jesus saved that one for last is because then you're applying the ethics of all of the others to that circumstance to say, when the persecution comes, when the hammer drops, when things get heavy, how am I going to respond? So rather than just, oh, God's got my back, he's going to get me through this, it's, am I going to respond the way that God's called me to respond in the situation? And I think that we can find probably, I always think of like the least significant examples when I think of these things. I wish I had better examples. But you know, when you're living your daily life and it seems like the world is after you, you have that terrible day where you got cut off and you felt like honking and shaking your fist and something didn't go well at the store and on, and all these things are coming upon you. There is this sort of, I think, virtuous way in which we respond to daily life, which is not quite persecution, of course, and I'm not trying to equate the two, but I do think that that's where that's leading, is how are you going to respond as you get into the midst of the persecution and the struggles.
What other questions do we have? Preachers, teachers, Greek translation questions?
I have one. It's not the most academic question, really, but which of the Beatitudes, as you're writing it, struck you the most, or which one did you find the most enjoyable to study?
That's a great question. Part of me wants to say that the one I enjoyed researching the most was that first one from the first book that was the impetus for the rest. So that's Matthew 5:5. Flourishing are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. The inherit the earth part is the thing, though, that originally drove me to that beatitude because it has inheritance language, and that was that first book project. The meekness is the thing, though, that ended up occupying most of my interest as I went along, because I started to do a lot of research on how meekness as a term. So if I'm right that it's that a virtue ethics reading is the right reading of those passages, those verses, I wanted to know how the terminology of meekness then worked as a virtue term, as an ethics term in the ancient world. And actually, it's the ancient philosophers talked about it all the time. So for example, Aristotle had this whole thing about the need for Greek kings to be meek, and the fact that he didn't think that they were very good at carrying themselves with meekness, and he uses the same terms there. And not only does Jesus say to us, you know, flourishing are the meek, but then Jesus himself is then called the meek king in Matthew 21. He uses the same terminology for Jesus himself, that he is a meek king. And I think that that's a kind of a reference to and a shot against Herod in the initial context of Matthew itself, but then potentially all paradigms for Greek kings throughout the history of the Greek and Roman empires. So thinking about what it means to be meek and how to carry yourself with meekness was really fun for me. One thing that I do go after, and again, I'm waiting for somebody eventually to read it and challenge me on this, is I've heard often this phrase preached in sermons, that meekness is not weakness, it's power under control. I'm sure a lot of us have probably heard that. Weakness is not meekness, it's power under control. Or meekness is not weakness, it's power under control. I disagree with that and call that out a little bit in the book, that I actually think that Jesus is not trying to say, oh, hey, it's not that you're weak, it's that you have power, but you just have to control it. But he's talking to people and teaching this to people who don't have any power, right? It's a very Western way maybe of thinking about it. Oh, God's not calling you to be weak. Well, actually, he probably is saying that not that you should have power and control it well, but that you should surrender the need for power in the first place. And so sort of trying to figure out how to relay then what Jesus seems to have meant to me with the way we would think about it in the modern world was really interesting for me. I think the peacemakers one was the next most interesting because it's not a word you find anywhere. I mean, Jesus didn't make it up, but it's a super, super rare word. And so trying to figure out what he might have meant without a whole lot of examples in the ancient world to compare it to was really interesting. But yeah, the meekness probably, Matthew 5:5 is my favorite.
Any other questions from our budding group of pastors and scholars? Yeah.
I'll follow with my brother Zach. It's not academic, but was there one that was the most challenging? Like as you're going through it, you can muddle over it, wrestle over it, and it maybe, you know, the research didn't go the way you wanted to. It was like hurting you a bit, different night.
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say not that the research was difficult or kept me up at night, but that it required maybe more thought to process, was probably the first one, Matthew 5:3, flourishing are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Because it's the one that drew me to the comparisons between Matthew's version of that beatitude and Luke's, right? Because Matthew, they both have the same one. Luke only has 4 beatitudes and Matthew has, I argue, 9. Some people think Matthew only has 8, some people think 10, I argue 9. But all of Luke's are in Matthew. They share the same ones, but Matthew just records more of Jesus' beatitudes than does Luke. But there are also changes. So in Luke, it's blessed are or flourishing are, depending on how you read it in Luke. I think it's different in Luke. The poor, for theirs is the kingdom of God. And in Matthew, it's flourishing are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Actually, in Luke, it's for yours is the kingdom of God. So the person, like, it goes from second person to third person. Matthew adds in spirit to the poor. Matthew changes kingdom of God to kingdom of heaven. So having to wrestle with all of these terminological changes was probably the thing that took the most amount of like mental space of trying to figure all that out. And I do mention all that in the book and try to make my way through that and draw conclusions. I do think you could argue that Luke probably does in his Beatitudes take a somewhat of a less ethical approach. I do think he probably is thinking more about disenfranchised and down and out people a little bit than maybe in Matthew, where it sounds like Jesus is teaching them in more of an ethical framework. And so trying to work out, if you think about oral history and oral tradition, Jesus probably taught these same Beatitudes several times. I mean, how many of us, right, some of us even young preachers, but especially those who have been preaching a while, how many of us have like the good sermon in the docket that you reuse, right, depending on where you're at? It's like, well, I preached that one at that church, but I'm in Indiana this week and nobody's ever heard me do that, so I'm just going to reuse that one. I mean, Jesus, the Son of God, did the same thing, right? We can be pretty confident that he probably taught the same thing over and over and over again in different towns, different villages, different contexts. And the oral traditions of those different things make their way through different avenues, right? So Luke is one tradition where Jesus probably is talking to a group that's very down and out. And maybe that's the ones that Luke hits on, especially because Luke as a gospel has a concern for the poor and the needy. Where Jesus might have taught them differently in a different context because the people he's speaking to wouldn't have resonated with that message quite the same way. They needed to hear more of the ethical connotations of what he's trying to communicate. And so he taught them a little bit differently. And instead of poor, it's poor in spirit. And right, so I had to wrestle a lot with why those changes got made. And I think that was, it was fun, but it was the most challenging probably.
Yeah.
I'm wondering in your translation of Makarios into flourishing, if you look at Psalm 1, beginning of Psalm 1, Asherah, in Septuagint is also translated as Makarios.
Right.
And I just want to see if you go that way and then to see the entire Psalm, especially Psalm 1, as also a source for flourishing.
Yeah, so I did look at a lot of the Beatitudes in other texts like in the Psalms. A lot of the English translations for the Psalms, by the way, this is, I think, fascinating because you'll have psalm or Beatitudes in the Psalms where Makarios will be, Makarios is Greek, right? And you're thinking, well, the Psalms are in Hebrew, but that's so in the Septuagint, in the Greek translation, you'll have Makarios there. And Makarios in a lot of the Psalms gets translated as happy now. But the same Bibles that will change Makarios in the Psalms to happy will still keep it as blessed in Matthew 5 because there's less of a hang-up. If you read a psalm that has Makarios and it says happy, no one's really going to notice or grumble about it. But if you then change the Beatitudes to happy are, then everyone's like, whoa, wait a minute, why'd you change this? That's supposed to be blessed. So that's interesting. I think I wanted to point that out. But yeah, I did look at a lot of the Psalms where a lot of the Beatitudes pop up and even other places, because even Matthew has a few more later in the text. And I do think that, again, there are a few different ways Beatitudes can be used, and I think the Psalms actually uses it in different ways at different times. But I do think that the flourishing nature is there in a lot of the Psalms, I think, which is why some of the English translations are changing them from blessed to happy, even in some of the more recent translations. Yeah. And actually, sorry, real quick, there's also one of the Beatitudes in Matthew that quotes a psalm that's not a Beatitude. Matthew 5:5 quotes Psalm 37 and turns it into a Beatitude, but in the psalm it isn't one, which I think is really fascinating. So, anyway.
Yeah.
I'm just curious, if you're going to preach a series on the Beatitudes, would you recommend a message for each particular one, with perhaps an introductory message on having to do with the connectedness of the Beatitudes, the major themes that you would come back to from time to time then? Maybe not the what of each Beatitude, but the why of the Beatitudes?
That's a great question. I mean, for me, a dream scenario now that I've written it, and when I used to be a pastor, I could have gotten away with this, but now it might be harder to convince somebody to give me a pulpit for 9 or 10 weeks. But, but yeah, a dream scenario for me would be to do an introductory sermon on the whole thing, and then still do an individual sermon on every individual beatitude, tying the theme of the Beatitudes as a whole into each of them. Of course, the downside is that there are going to be people who aren't going to attend all of those. Maybe they missed that introductory sermon and they show up for Matthew 5:7 and they're like, well, wait a minute, where did all that come from? And that's the danger, right? Like, wait, what is he talking about flourishing? Where did this come from? And, well, I talked about that several weeks ago when, you were at the lake or whatever. And so I think there's a danger of that. But if you're careful enough about being able to take that introductory sermon and still weave it into the rest, I think there's a whole lot of material that could easily make for an individual sermon for each of the 9 Beatitudes and an introductory one. So I think we're talking like 2.5 months worth just right there. I mean, there's one of the Beatitudes in here, I think on just one of them I've got like 35 pages on it or something, because there's so much to unpack. So yeah, I would love to see somebody do each one individually.
So I'm taking this as coming to a church near you. Or chapel planning team. Here's an idea for next year. Any lingering questions? Rylan?
Yeah, I'm curious, what do you think Matthew would think of you taking and writing a book just on the Beatitudes when he has placed the Beatitudes in the larger sermon together? He's like, no, I've put them all together. Maybe what's the relationship between the Beatitudes and the rest of the Sermon on the Mount?
That's a phenomenal question, and I do address it a little bit in the book, because I do think that, well, for one, the Sermon on the Mount itself as a whole sermon has been treated in a way that's disembodied. They disembody it from the rest of the text. And there are some scholars who have even argued in the past that you should do it that way. Hans-Dieter Betz is maybe the most famous. He's a German scholar who argued that the Sermon on the Mount was an isolated unit that had virtually no relationship to the rest of Matthew, that could be taught, thought about, and preached completely by itself, and that you didn't even need the rest of the narrative. Thankfully, and I really respect a lot of his work, actually, I think he's was a bright guy, but I think that's way off. And thankfully, most Matthean scholars have now recognized that that's way off. That both the Beatitudes are threaded into the rest of the sermon and the rest of Matthew quite intricately, and that the sermon as a whole is threaded into Matthew intricately, and that you cannot study them in complete isolation. So if I had done that, it would have been a huge mistake, and it wouldn't have really borne much fruit. But thankfully, I actually, in the introduction, introduced the book by saying that what I'm doing is what you can call a narrative reading of the text. So instead of historical critical questions, which I don't really spend a lot of time on, or all these sort of, I don't spend a whole lot of time comparing Matthew to other things outside of Matthew. My goal is just a narrative reading of Matthew itself, and with every beatitude, it's connecting the unit of the beatitudes and the individual beatitudes with stuff going on in the entire Gospel of Matthew from beginning to end. And I really mean beginning to end. I mean, I make references literally to Matthew 1:1, and then I make references to Matthew 28:16 to 20 at various points, and everything in between. So there is a sense, my hope is that you can learn a whole lot about the whole Gospel of Matthew by reading it, not just the Beatitudes, but I definitely disagree with the approaches to the text which have been found in books over time of disconnecting it and teaching it as its own thing. I don't think that's fruitful at all.
We're about at the end of our time, but I did want to ask you one more question. This came out in May, but what's on the horizon for you?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I have this weird, maybe I'm not alone. It feels weird to me. Maybe one of my colleagues can commiserate with me afterwards and let me know if you do the same. But I have this sort of this set of files on my computer that has the next 5 or 6 possible projects, full proposals for them that are really just for my benefit. I haven't shown most of them to anyone yet. So I have a lot of things I want to work on. The thing I'm working on now is actually in Paul, which I love to read Paul and do research on Paul, even though I mostly do Gospels research, and most of my future projects are in Gospels. But I am working on a Paul project right now on kinship language in particular. So I mentioned that my first book was on inheritance, but I did inheritance in from Genesis clear up through the rest of the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, and into the sort of Second Temple non-biblical texts in Matthew, but I didn't do it for Paul, and I would like to, so I'm doing a lot on inheritance in Paul, because he mentions inheritance language a lot. And then I'm also doing, Paul uses inheritance and adoption together. That the way you gain an inheritance from God is because you've been adopted by God. And by the way, adoption language, you can't find that anywhere in ancient Israel's scriptures. Paul's the only one in the whole Bible that uses adoption as a metaphor for our relationship with God, and he connects it to the inheritance we receive from him. So right now the thing I'm working on is that. I'm analyzing the adoption and inheritance language in Paul's letters. But when that's over, I also have had this goal for years that I want to do two other things. I want to write an advanced introduction to Matthew, because most of the introductions to Matthew that I find are for the general reader, which is great, we need that, but that's what they all are. And I want to write a very advanced introduction that's dealing with the most advanced issues with scholarship in the text. And then also Jesus in Matthew is just the brilliance of his teaching. Jesus takes Israel's old wisdom teachings, things like Proverbs and wisdom psalms and Ecclesiastes, and its old apocalyptic style teachings like Daniel. He takes those styles of communication and Jesus smushes them together in Matthew. There are several places where there's apocalyptic ideas and wisdom ideas, and they're molded together into one set of communications. And so I want to write something where I can kind of pick that apart and see, try to tap into the brilliance of his mind, I guess, and pick apart how he's taking these old traditions and forming a whole new tradition out of them by bringing them together into one. So that sounds like a complex idea, and it probably is. It'll take a long time maybe to weed through it, but that's another thing I want to work on in the future.
Well, for now, congratulations on Ideal Disciples. Thank you so much for being here tonight, for sharing with us a little bit about the story behind this book, the content. And if this hasn't convinced you guys already to go buy this, go get it. Read it. You will be blessed by it. Let's give Dr. Daley a round of applause.
And thank you all so much for coming. I'm sure some of you are bribed with food, but I believe that you were all here to support the book, and I'm just, really grateful to see you all.